Well, hello there. It's been a while. Welcome to my new set. Well, this isn't exactly a set, but I put that camera, which isn't normally there, in the same spot that the camera was before when this was a set, so you could see how the space transformed. But now it's just a spot that I like hanging out in. And I do have a couple cameras over here in case I want to live stream or whatever, which of course begs the question, Gerald, I thought you were retired. Why are you talking about cameras again? Well, I am retired. This is kind of the last chapter of my camera review period because this camera, or rather the Sony FX3 Mark II, was a long-awaited, much-anticipated camera, as well as Sony's camera that's going to have internal RAW and open gate and the successor to FX3 and all that stuff. We've been talking about it for a year, and after the release of the A7R6, which I didn't post a video on my channel, but I did do a collab with Mark Bennett, if you want to check that out. I did have the camera and I did test it. I was kind of waiting for this camera to sort of close the book, the final chapter on this sort of generation of Sony cameras. Now, I'm not going to do a thorough review. I'm just going to share the results from the tests that I wanted to do based on what piqued my curiosity. I'll leave the rest of the stuff to the other reviewers. And of course, this also gives me an opportunity to talk about Storyblocks, the sponsor of today's video. Now, the reason I brought up the A7R6 and why I was curious to make this video in the first place is that the sensor, to a certain extent, on the A7R6 is actually the same one in the FX5. And I don't think this will be obvious to most people because the FX5 is marketed as a 5K video camera, and this is a, whatever it is, 60-something megapixel photo camera. But if you take the resolution of the A7R6, the horizontal and vertical resolution, and you divide both by exactly 2, you get the exact same resolution of this camera. And when you shoot in the 4K video modes of this camera, it's oversampled and read out from that 5K resolution, again, the one that's divided by like a 2x2 combination, which means the 4K video on this camera is extracted from the exact same sensor resolution and plane and everything as this camera. Now, there were some differences, which I was pleased to see, which means this isn't just an A7S3 to FX3 type of thing where you go, well, that's pretty much the same camera, but this one doesn't have a viewfinder, until multiple firmware updates later where the FX3 kind of carved itself out to be a little bit different. This one, right off the bat, this one is definitely more video focused. It has internal RAW, it has open gate recording, and also the method at which they've taken this sensor from the A7R6 and put it in this body, they did it in a way that allowed for more bandwidth, a more robust connection, and it allowed for actually slightly faster read speeds, which are going to be important when this thing ultimately gets its 4K 240 firmware update sometime in the future. It needed to be just that little bit faster. So this is kind of like an overclocked A7R6 in a way. And then they've also changed how the dual native ISOs interact, where on the A7R6, I think it was like 805,000. On this one, they did the 800 and 12,800 that people probably would have expected to shoot alongside their FX3. But then they also put in a third one, similar to the A7R6 at 4,000 to give you a little bit of a middle cleanup rather than having to go all the way from 800 to 12,800 to improve your image. But let's get into the rolling shutter and dynamic range results so I can show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so we'll start with the FX5 in the 4K 16:9 full frame mode. Now this one is read from the 5K full frame aspect of the sensor, which means it's full width, but that 5K again is derived from a greater resolution, the 60 whatever megapixels of the A7R6. So it's kind of like a 2x2 pixel binning thing down to the 5K, then oversampled down to the 4K. And doing this, we get 5.7 milliseconds, which is a little bit faster than the 7 milliseconds or whatever we got in the A7R6. Again, consider it kind of overcranked compared to that camera. And it can do this because, again, of the better bandwidth and of the internal fan, the active cooling on this camera. And just like on the A7R6, you can turn on dual gain in certain modes. And when doing that, the read speed jumps up to 14.2 milliseconds, which is basically reading the sensor twice, merging a high gain and a low gain mode to improve dynamic range and noise performance, which again, slightly faster than I think it was like 15 or 16 milliseconds on the A7R6. Now the A7R6 was already great to get 15 milliseconds in a dual gain mode. So this is even better that it's scoring 14.2. But of course, this camera now has an open gate mode, which is the full 3x2 aspect ratio of the sensor. And in that mode, with dual gain, because you can do both open gate and dual gain in internal RAW, you get 18.4 milliseconds. So this is the slowest this sensor gets, 18.4 milliseconds with everything maxed out. But then if you turn off dual gain and you shoot just the 5K open gate, it's 8.5 milliseconds, which is really, really, really good for an open gate internal RAW mode to be able to do an 8.5 milliseconds. It's pretty solid. Now, before we move on to the dynamic range results, I want to take a quick minute to thank Storyblocks for sponsoring this video. So Storyblocks is a stock media library where every asset is made by a professional filmmaker, artist, or musician. They don't accept AI-generated content, which means not only is the entire library 100% human-made, but that every download directly supports an actual working artist. They bring together high-quality stock footage, music, sound effects, and motion graphics templates into a single, easy-to-navigate platform filled with tools to make your creative ideas come to fruition faster. Everything you download is royalty-free, pre-licensed, and ready for personal, commercial, or monetized projects with no worrying about usage rights. The library is deep and diverse with unlimited downloads, and best of all, for a limited time, Storyblocks is offering 15% off any annual plan, but that discount is only available through my link. So to get access to this human-made stock library that's built for creators, head to storyblocks.com/undone or click the link in the description. Okay, so for dynamic range. If you don't know, I use a chart called the Xyla 21, which has patches of light that descend in intensity that you can film, and then you take those results and you put it through a program called Imatest. Along the top of most of these charts, you'll see what I recorded. So for this first example here, it's the FX5 shooting an XOCN, so that's the internal RAW, in 5K open gate at ISO 800, which is the lowest base ISO, with noise reduction turned off. That's a cool thing, by the way. You can turn noise reduction off on this camera, something that most, FX3 type cameras don't have. And then over here, you have slope-based DR, which is the total stops the dynamic range of the detected, which in this case is 14. And then the numbers below that are noise tolerances. So if you look at the medium, for example, that would be a signal noise ratio of 2. And in that case, we get 11.5 stops. This is a good number to compare of how many good clean stops we have. Now, if we put the noise reduction back on to its default medium setting, we still get the 14 total stops, but the medium score jumps up to 11.9. That gives you an idea of how much the sort of default noise reduction at ISO 800 is doing. But if we put it in dual gain mode, the slope-based DR stays around the same, 14.2, but the medium score jumps up to 14, which means now we're getting 14 clean usable stops when dual gain mode is enabled with the noise reduction on medium. And even if we turn noise reduction off in the dual gain 5K open gate XOCN mode, we still keep 13.9 stops on the medium. And then I took it off RAW and put in the XAVC-SI, which is the all intra codec, again in 4K, ISO 800 with noise reduction on medium. And we got 14.9 stops total with 12.8 clean stops. And this is usually what happens when you compare RAW to a non-RAW codec, because RAW is generally noisier than a non-RAW mode. And in this case, we're seeing results similar to what we would see on, like an FX3 or an alpha camera, where you can't shoot RAW and you don't have control over noise reduction. You would see something like this, like 15 stops with high 12s on the medium. But then I bumped it up to ISO 12,800 so we could see how that top third base ISO performs. And we got really good results, 14.6 and 12.7. So hardly any dip in the medium score going from ISO 800 to ISO 12,800. And then I thought it'd be good to test the FX3 at the same time to compare how its ISO 12,800 performs, because I assume a lot of people want to know, how's the low light compared to my FX3? And the answer is the FX5 is better. The FX3 got a 12.3 at ISO 12,800 from 14.2 stops total, where the FX5 got 12.7. So at 12,800, the low light performance is actually better on the FX5 than it is on the FX3. And lastly, if we shoot dual gain mode at ISO 800 with noise reduction on medium in the all intra 4K mode, we get 14.7 stops total with 14 stops on the medium. Now, next up, I want to talk a little bit about color and image quality. Now, this is the part of the video where I usually promote my own LUTs. And I'm going to do that in this video as well, because I've made updated LUTs for the FX5. Now, I will say that you could probably just throw the A7R6 LUTs on them and it'll work almost identically, because the color was so close. But I do have updated LUTs for the A7R6, the FX5, and the FX3. Now, if you've already bought my LUTs, you're going to get an upgrade for all of these, and the FX5 one will get sent to you for free. But if you're just buying the LUTs now, the FX5 will be included in that pack. What they offer, basically, if you've never heard of them before, is really accurate, like technically accurate color and sort of a baseline standard in Rec 709 to bring all the cameras to the same sort of neutral point. So if you're mixing between Sony cameras or even cameras from other systems that I offer LUTs for, they should all match quite well compared to what they would with the manufacturer's LUTs. Anyway, link in the description, geraldandunn.com/LUTs. But that also kind of wraps up the color section. I would normally go into the details of how the color's different, but if you look at these two images, it's pretty much identical between the A7R6 and the FX5, which means the FX5 falls more in line with the latest color ideas that Sony's had and is a little bit different than what the FX3 would have if you're coming from an FX3, in which case something like my LUTs would be handy for matching them. But if you want to see on a vector scope what the FX3 versus FX5 looks like, here's the differences between them. And you can see that if I switch over to the A7R6, produce pretty much the same image as they should, like I said, since they're using the same sort of base layer of the sensor. And if we go into a detail shot here, you can see what I mean. When I compare the A7R6 to the FX5, we're getting pretty much the same amount of detail in the same image, again, as we should, because that's only logical. But I also wanted to compare it to the FX3, because when the A7R6 came out, I heard some complaints that the image seemed soft in 4K to some reviewers. And I think maybe they were comparing it to 8K and 7K oversampled cameras, which is fair because the A7R6, is marketed more as one of those cameras. But I guess the tricky part is the A7R6 in video mode is actually operating more like an FX3 or FX5 and not like an A7 IV, which is a 7K oversample for 4K video. It's not doing that. It's binning down to 5K and then oversampling from that. So I thought, let's instead compare the detail to the FX3 because they're shooting Hollywood movies on an FX3, so clearly there's enough detail to do that. And as you can see, I think it's the same or probably even slightly better than the FX3. So is the 4K video soft? No, not at all. It's not any softer than an FX3. In fact, it's a little bit sharper. But it is softer than, 7K photo cameras that are oversampled or some of the competitors, again, 7K oversampled cameras. But again, you're going to have trade-offs there, right? You're not going to get a camera that's going to read as fast as this camera and be truly oversampling from those things. So you have to choose between sharpness and detail or read speed. I would probably choose a camera that's more balanced like this, since I've seen the results of an FX3, which again is even slightly softer. I've seen them on an IMAX screen and they look perfectly fine in terms of detail. So I'd rather have the faster camera that still looks good enough for IMAX than a 7K oversampled camera that is too slow. I will say though that if your primary purpose is content creation on the internet, then those oversampled images might actually be a little bit better, the 7 and 8K oversampled ones, because they cut through the YouTube compression a little bit better than a 4 and 5K image would. I find you kind of have to add sharpness to everything for YouTube, but you might have to add a little bit more for a camera like the FX5. So that's it as far as my test results. I think the camera performs really well when it comes to the testing. I do have some notes though on my personal experience with using it and maybe some warnings. I'm sure that the other channels are covering this a lot, especially talking about ergonomics and stuff like that. But this is a different camera than the FX3. It is much more like using an FX6, FX9, Burano, whatever. It's prioritizing sort of a multi-function wheel like you would find on a cinema camera to do everything with no thumb wheel on the back anymore. And the menu system is the Cine menu system, not the Alpha menu system that you see on the FX3. Now I find we'll call it the Alpha menu system, I find that one better, more intuitive, and easier to use and faster, and I'm more comfortable with it. Where I find the Cine system has some advantages in terms of features that it offers, like the ability to turn off noise reduction. There's better autofocus settings in there, like you can set it to face-only autofocus, so when it doesn't detect your face, it stops focusing on other things, which is kind of cool, as well as the ability to customize your HDMI output and get more out of it than you can on the Alpha cameras, where like when you put the Alpha cameras in log mode, HDMI is limited to 1080p, like weird things like that. You're not going to have those problems in the Cine menu. Yet strangely, even this camera with all the new codecs and everything else, it has an HS mode for H.265 codecs, and you still can't shoot 25 or 30p in the H.265 modes, even on this camera, where I kind of thought it would be solved on this one with the new menu. But it's the same issue with all the Alpha cameras, where you have to be in H.264 if you want to shoot 25 or 30p. And this one, you can shoot RAW and everything else, but if you're in H.265, still no 25 or 30p, which has never been explained to me why that is. And you'd think with all the extra power and new battery and everything else, they'd solve it, but no, maybe it's some sort of licensing thing or who knows what. But that's still a limitation. Other than that, pretty much everything is there in the Cine menu, which is nice. I just find it cumbersome to navigate. And because of the Cine menu, it's got things like when you change certain options, the camera has to reboot and things are on different pages and stuff. So you're definitely going to want to set up a custom My menu like you would on a Cine camera, because otherwise it's just harder to use. It's a harder to use camera, and it's not a hybrid camera at all, despite it kind of having the sort of hybrid shape. This is purely video. I don't even think it takes photos. I'm pretty sure it doesn't. So this is purely a video camera, and one that I think if you have your mind, if you're coming from an FX6 or a Burano or something, and you want this as a smaller version of the camera, I think that your brain will already be in the right place for it. But if you have 3 FX3s and you're adding this into the mix, every time you go to this camera, you're gonna be like, how do I use it again? Because it does not operate ergonomically like an FX3. But props to the screen. The screen on this thing is Sony's best screen ever. It's bigger, it's brighter, but it still has the mechanism from the A7R6, so it can flip out and rotate and completely turn around and do everything it wants to do while being a bigger, brighter, better screen. And I appreciate the other little inclusions like false color and stuff like that. Basically, to make the list of features that the Sony has now equal or competitive to, everybody else that's out there, where before they might have done certain performance things better but be lacking in features. Now they have all the features for the people that wanted them. I still don't care about open gate and stuff like that, but it's good that there's a camera that has them all, so that if you're on the Sony system with a bunch of Sony lenses and stuff like that, you don't have to feel like you're missing out on something. Other than that, it's a great camera. Just like every other camera that's come out in the last 2 years, it's fantastic. And I hope that the test results that I did share were useful to you in some way. They answered the questions I had about this, and now I feel like I can stop testing cameras for a long time, because all the things that were sort of still in the pipeline that I was curious about are now answered. But it was nice seeing you again. Now I'm going to get back to doing whatever I was doing before I was doing this. What? All right. I'm done.